Before we can judge the value of any intellectual effort, we must ask, what makes thought coherent, meaningful, or even possible in the first place? The answer lies in something so fundamental that it's often overlooked: the basic laws of logic. These are not optional conventions or cultural inventions. They are the underlying rules that govern all intelligible thought. The law of identity: a thing is what it is. A statement, concept, or object must be self-identical to be meaningful. The law of non-contradiction: a statement cannot be both true and false in the same respect at the same time. The law of excluded middle: a proposition must be either true or not true. There is no third option. These principles are not abstract formalities. They are what make it possible to assert, question, infer, evaluate, or understand anything at all. Without them, reasoning collapses into noise, and discourse becomes incoherent. With this in mind, we are in a position to ask a much deeper question. When does intellectual work truly matter? The answer must begin here. Intellectual work matters when it honors and imparts these fundamental laws. It matters when it helps people to reason more clearly, to recognize contradictions, to understand reality more truthfully. It matters when it strengthens our capacity for coherence, clarity, and truth-seeking. And all of these things rely on the laws of logic. Not all intellectual activity is equal. Much of it may dazzle, entertain, provoke, or persuade, but only that which respects and promotes the basic laws of logic can serve as a genuine vehicle for knowledge and meaning. That is the threshold for intellectual integrity and the foundation of all real inquiry. The category of intellectual work that truly matters is that which amplifies the foundational conditions of knowledge, truth, and autonomy. Intellectual work matters at the most fundamental level when it empowers the mind to grasp and make use of the laws of logic. When it clarifies identity, exposes contradiction, and enables decisive thought. It participates in the most essential task of human inquiry, making reality intelligible. This is no abstract ideal. It has direct existential and political relevance. A person who can reason logically is not merely smarter or more correct, they are more free. Logical clarity is intellectual liberation. It gives the individual the tools to resist manipulation, navigate uncertainty, discern truth from error, and build knowledge on solid ground. In this way, the cultivation of logic is not just a cognitive act, but a moral and emancipatory one. Intellectual work rises to its highest purpose when it serves this emancipatory function. When it teaches others how to reason well. It increases not just knowledge, but agency. It aligns with reality not through dogma, but through principled inquiry that respects the non-negotiable constraints of truth itself. Conversely, intellectual work loses its value becomes counterfeit when it obscures these principles. Work that relativizes truth, glamorizes contradiction, or treats logic as optional is not deep or provocative. It is epistemically negligent. It contributes not to understanding, but to confusion, not to autonomy, but to dependency. This is the great criterion. Does the work illuminate or distort the laws of logic? Does it strengthen the reader's capacity for coherent thought or undermine it? In this light, we can say without exaggeration, to teach logic well is among the highest intellectual and ethical callings. It is not simply training in technique. It is the transmission of the very conditions of knowledge. It is the cultivation of a mind that can stand on its own. To impart the laws of logic is to give someone the most precious inheritance available to a thinking being, the capacity to know what is true, to reject what is false, and to move through the world with clarity and integrity. This is when intellectual work matters most. A common objection sometimes raised, often with a tone of intellectual superiority, is that logic has no content, and therefore cannot matter in any substantive way. This view imagines logic as a sterile formalism, an empty shell through which no real knowledge passes, a kind of procedural scaffolding that contributes nothing to actual understanding. But this objection collapses under its own weight. The claim, logic has no content, is itself a contentful proposition, and it depends on logic to even be intelligible. It assumes the law of identity, that the term logic refers to a coherent object. It assumes the law of non-contradiction, that the statement is not simultaneously true and false. And it assumes the law of excluded middle, that it must be either true or not true. In short, no one can assert that logic doesn't matter without relying on logic. This reveals a fatal performative contradiction. The objection uses the very thing it denies. The attempt to discard logic is like trying to saw off the branch one is sitting on, except here, the branch is the very possibility of meaningful thought. It's true, in a narrow sense, that logic doesn't provide empirical content. But this is not a flaw. It's the point. Logic is not a content provider, but a content enabler. It gives structure to content, allowing us to distinguish sense from nonsense, coherence from contradiction, truth from falsehood. Logic is what makes content intelligible. To say that logic has no content is like saying that grammar has no meaning. Of course it doesn't in itself. But without it, no meaning could ever be expressed. Even more deeply, logic makes the distinction between content and non-content possible. Without the laws of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle, the very idea of a proposition having content versus none becomes incoherent. The notion of something rather than nothing, true rather than false, meaningful rather than meaningless, presupposes logic. To deny logic is not to deny a theory, but to deny the conditions of meaning themselves. So while logic may not contain empirical facts, it is what allows facts to be stated, tested, compared, and known. It is the precondition of all knowledge, not a competitor for its content. This is why logic matters most. It is the silent structure beneath all understanding, the reason anything means anything at all. It is tempting, especially in an age saturated with opinion, performance, and persuasion, to downplay the significance of logic. Some simply dismiss and claim that logic doesn't matter. But such dismissals are not only mistaken, they are deeply revealing. They show us what happens when epistemic virtue erodes. Epistemic virtue refers to the intellectual character traits that make knowledge possible. The love of truth, the willingness to reason carefully, the humility to question one's own assumptions, the patience to follow arguments where they lead, the courage to accept uncomfortable conclusions. Without these virtues, logic will always seem unnecessary or even threatening. But this rejection is self-defeating. If a person truly does not care about truth, coherence, or rational justification, then of course they will not care about logic, because logic is the very structure by which truth becomes discernible. Logic is what distinguishes truth from error, sense from nonsense. To dismiss it is to declare implicitly or explicitly that one does not care whether what they think or say is true. This isn't merely intellectually irresponsible, but a form of epistemic nihilism. It is the declaration that anything can be believed, that contradiction is permissible, that persuasion trumps reason, and that inquiry has no real standards. Such a stance doesn't just undermine particular arguments, it undermines the very possibility of argument. It doesn't just reject conclusions, it rejects the basis for evaluating any conclusion at all. But the truth is unavoidable. You cannot reject logic without using logic. The very act of arguing against its importance presupposes its validity. One cannot claim logic doesn't matter without asserting a proposition, presupposing identity, denying contradiction, and relying on excluded middle. The person who denies logic must smuggle it in to make their denial intelligible. This is the mark of deep intellectual incoherence and ignorance. So the question becomes not whether logic matters. It does inescapably matter. But whether we have the epistemic character to recognize and honor that fact. Intellectual work matters when it is grounded in epistemic virtue. And epistemic virtue begins with the commitment to reason, to truth, and to the logical principles that make both possible. To do serious work in logic is not merely to amuse oneself with abstract puzzles or to chase intellectual trends. It is to engage with something that possesses enduring foundational value. The laws of logic are not ephemeral tools. They are the permanent conditions that make truth, understanding, and meaning possible in any context, in any time, for any rational being. Unlike much intellectual work, which may be shaped by cultural fashions, political needs, subjective desires, or historical contingencies, logic is timeless in its applicability. So far as we can tell, there will never be a moment past, present, or future when the principles of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle will cease to matter. This is because they do not merely describe how we happen to think. They articulate the necessary form that any intelligible thought must take. In this sense, work in logic has foundational value. It does not rest on other insights, it grounds them. It is not valuable because it leads somewhere else. It is valuable because it enables everything else. It is the root system beneath the entire tree of knowledge. And to engage with that root system directly is to touch the most stable and universal structure we have. To study, teach, or develop the principles of logic, then, is not just to solve intellectual problems. It is to safeguard the conditions under which truth can be known at all. It is to contribute to a body of knowledge whose relevance does not expire. Logic is not only useful, it is indispensable. And the intellectual work that strengthens our relationship to it is, by that very fact, among the most meaningful contributions that a human mind can make.